Chapter 7. Through the Flickering Light. It's a good thing that I decided to make this house, but this life is not what I wanted. The same thing I was running away from. Catch me. I really bad lucky. Prudence absent-mindedly massaged the smooth, baby pink painted wall as she mused. Long before she'd known that she would retire in Jamaica, she'd decided that she'd like somewhere of her own when she visited home. She hadn't wanted to be a burden to anyone. And she was old and set in her ways, she'd told herself. She'd wanted to go and come as she pleased and to eat and drink what she wanted, when she wanted it. For over 30 years, she'd visited Jamaica and had spent weeks at a time with Constance. Constance had transformed the old family home, a 2-bedroom house, into a lovely pink cottage. She'd seemed to be content there, with her many fowls and her ever-rotating roster of cats. Prudence hadn't wanted to disrupt her life by moving in with her, even though one of the rooms was hers. The house was good for vacations, she told herself, but not for long-term stay, so she discussed the idea of making her own house with Constance. They decided that the yard space was big enough, so she would build on a plot of land to the right of Constance's house. From the time that she'd been settled in Canada, she'd sent money to Constance to save. She was her only sister and she trusted her with everything she had. Constance had invested her money well and she was pleased with the amount that she'd amassed over the years. She'd heard stories about people in foreign countries who had sent their money home to relatives to save or to buy or build a house, but when they'd returned home, there'd been no money and no house. She'd been happy that she hadn't had to worry about those problems. After she'd decided to build her own house, she'd restricted her travel home and had used that money to help finance the construction. 3 years after the workmen had begun working on the house, Constance had called her with the good news. The house was finished and it looked good. Her excitement had been palpable and she'd urged her to come see the house. A year later, she'd traveled home to see her new house. She'd taken an early flight to reach River Valley long before night and had reabsorbed all the familiarity of home on the 70-mile trip. The hustle and bustle of the streets of Kingston, the travails of the winding junction road overlooking cavernous precipices, the sea in its different shades of blue along the coast, even the shower that had greeted her as she'd entered River Valley, just to stop as suddenly as it had started, had brightened her heart. Before she'd exited the car, she'd peered through the window to get a glimpse of her new home. Her heart had raced a bit, just as it had done when she'd got the keys to her home in Canada. She'd seen splashes of color on the hillside through the trees, but not where she'd expected her house to be. She hadn't worried. Her house was up there, somewhere. She'd rushed to get home while John, who'd met her at the airport, had tramped behind her carrying her suitcase on his shoulder. When she'd reached the path leading up to her house, there were steps where none had been before. It had seemed as if the house had come to meet her, its bulk threatening her. It was not where she'd expected it to be. A monstrous baby pink-colored house with hints of rose pink, protected by a low decorative concrete white wall, sat in a hollow in the side of the familiar hill. She'd counted the steps as she'd climbed, 12 rectangular, rough-cast, concrete steps. When she'd stepped onto the paved front yard, Constance had been waiting for her against the rose-pink backdrop of the veranda walls. They'd greeted each other and Prudence had felt her excitement. Constance had been eager to show her the house, but she'd had no wish to see it then. She'd slumped into one of the 2 rocking chairs on the veranda, the one to which Constance had directed her, and had tried to control her breathing. "You tired?" Constance had said, and had taken the other chair. She'd talked about topics in which Prudence had had no interest. Her own internal conversation had consumed her, while she'd bided her time until John had taken trips down to the village square to collect the rest of her luggage. After John had returned with her last bag and she'd paid him and had promised him something from the barrels that she'd sent, and he'd left, she'd forced herself to say, "Constance, I told you I wanted a single-level house with a wrap-around veranda. This is not it." "Nonsense," Constance had said. "Mas Clifford did a good job. If we decide to do any more work on the house we can use him." That was not the answer she'd expected and, for a moment, she hadn't been sure how to respond. She hadn't particularly cared whether or not Mas Clifford had done a good job. She'd not got what she'd ordered. She'd waited, but apparently Constance had done talking, so she'd asked her, "Why you never ask Mas Clifford to build the house that I told you I wanted?" "Sure, Prudence. Stop nagging," Constance had snapped. This house is much better than the one you wanted. Wraparound veranda. You must think that we live in the past. It is modern times now. Step into the light. Nowhere rain fall like here in River Valley. When rain fall and breeze blow and all the water come in on the veranda, who going to wipe it off? Prudence bristled at the remembered disdain and mockery that had infused Constance's words. She felt her anger soaring. It was her house. Shouldn't she be the one to clean up any mess? Her wraparound veranda would have been the place to sit, have her tea, read her Bible and her books and entertain her visitors. She'd wanted to spend as much time indoors as outdoors and be able to enjoy the community from all sides. But no. Constance had had different ideas. She swallowed, took a deep breath and returned to relive her perpetual aggravation. Before she could have blasted Constance for trampling on her wishes and feelings, Constance had said, "Enjoy what you have and forget what you hope you had. Come on. Come look at the house," and had skipped away like a child with a new present that she'd wanted to show off to a friend. Enjoy what she had. Probably endure what she had. Prudence had thought. She'd trailed behind Constance as she'd shown her around downstairs. There were 3 bedrooms, a master bedroom and 2 other bedrooms with a bathroom between them. There was a large living room, with shiny, dark mahogany furniture, a few glass-topped tables strewn around the room and pictures on the walls, mostly pictures of Constance. To the right of the living room was a large kitchen, a dining room through the kitchen, as well as a utility room. The house didn't look bad, she'd admitted. It was quite spacious and nicely decorated, but it was more Constance than her. She'd made a note to herself to change a few things here and there as soon as she'd rested. She'd been tired after her travel, her disappointment and the tour and had been ready to fall into her bed, but she'd remembered that there was an upstairs. She'd had no intention to visit up there, but out of curiosity, she'd asked Constance, "So, what's upstairs?" "Your apartment," Constance had said, and had urged her to go look at it because she would like it. Prudence felt the rage rising up inside her again. She tamped it down. She'd spent the last 15 years doing that. She leaned against the wall and wallowed in her memories. Her apartment was upstairs. Constance had been halfway up the staircase before she'd realized that she'd been alone. Prudence had plunked herself on the arm of the floral settee with its pink undertones. Constance had rushed down the stairs to scold her. "You don't want to destroy it before you enjoy it," she'd asked her, and had grabbed her arm and had tried to move her from off her perch, but she hadn't budged. She'd felt a tightening in her chest, as horror had overwhelmed her and made her faint. She'd sat there clutching her chest and had waited for the faintness to subside while Constance's voice had clawed through the cobweb-like fog that had enveloped her. "One level. One level." Those words had played through Prudence's mind. She'd told Constance that she hadn't wanted any upstairs house. Upstairs house was not for everybody. Since Constance had decided to make upstairs house, why didn't she take the upstairs for herself? Constance just did what she wanted and thought about nobody but herself. Prudence's thoughts raged. She dredged up a breath from deep inside and whispered, "Any time I leave this world, it will be Constance's fault."